The mist clings low over the rolling hills of Gaul, and the dense forests seem to whisper secrets long forgotten. Here, in the quiet corners of a continent in the throes of transformation, a dynasty of kings once claimed divine right, yet their power may have depended not on the strength of their armies or the size of their kingdoms, but on the shadowy influence of women whose names have largely vanished from the pages of history. The Merovingians, rulers of the Franks from the 5th to the 8th century, are remembered for their flowing hair, their early medieval kingdoms, and the legends of a bloodline touched by the divine. Yet, beyond the gilded portraits of kings and the chronicles of conquest, lies a far murkier, far more intriguing story. The story of the hidden queens who may have shaped the destiny of Europe from behind the throne. Most historical records speak of kings with almost reverent detail. They are chronicled as conquerors, legislators, and men chosen by God to rule. Yet the women who surrounded them, wives, mothers, and daughters, often appear only as footnotes, their influence muted, their ambitions erased. But what if history has been selective in its memory? What if the queens, the women of Merovingia, wielded power in ways that were never officially recorded, ways that were subtle yet potent, shaping not only courtly politics, but the very destiny of the bloodline itself? In these quiet, almost invisible roles, they may have been the true custodians of sacred knowledge, guardians of a lineage shrouded in mystery and myth. Imagine a young queen, barely more than a girl, navigating the treacherous world of Merovingian courts. Her husband, a king, commands armies and receives homage. Yet it is she who maintains the delicate balance of alliances, the network of loyalties that keeps a fragile kingdom intact. She moves in shadow, her influence invisible to the chroniclers who record only what is deemed worthy of history. Every marriage she arranges, every word she whispers to the king, could shift the balance of power, and yet her name may be lost to time, recorded only in fragments of letters, charters, or the occasional reference in a monk's margin. These women were not merely decorative ornaments in the royal court. Some were ruthless, some devout, and some wielded both cunning and compassion to extraordinary effect. They acted as regents for underage kings, negotiated treaties that could save a kingdom from collapse, and sometimes even directed military strategy from behind the curtain of social convention. And still, history has largely ignored them, allowing their stories to dissolve into the fog of legend. What survives is tantalizingly incomplete. A coin with a queen's likeness, a charter signed in her name, a cryptic entry in a monastery's ledger hinting at influence and intrigue. Each fragment suggests a world of hidden agency, a network of power that operated in silence, out of sight of the chroniclers who preferred the drama of kings and battles over the quiet, calculated power of women. The fascination with these hidden queens does not end with historical speculation. Rumors, myths, and esoteric theories have long hinted that the Merovingian bloodline itself was sacred, perhaps even holy, and that it was the queens who were entrusted with protecting the secret. They were the stewards of rituals, the keepers of traditions, and possibly the carriers of a knowledge that could alter the course of history if it ever fell into the wrong hands. Some suggest that their influence extended beyond mere politics, that it touched the mystical, the spiritual, even the divine. The kings may have worn crowns, but it was the queens who preserved the true power of the line. And so, as we step into the story of the hidden queens of Merovingia, we enter a world of contrasts, light and shadow, seen and unseen, recorded and erased. It is a story that challenges our assumptions about history itself, forcing us to ask not only what happened, but who controlled the currents beneath the surface. Were these queens merely companions to powerful men, or were they the architects of destiny, their fingerprints concealed beneath centuries of selective memory? The truth, as we shall see, is layered, complex, and endlessly fascinating. In their shadows, we may begin to glimpse a lost world where women's power was not denied. It was simply hidden. And in that hidden power lies a mystery that has haunted historians, mythmakers, and conspiracy theorists alike for centuries, a mystery that continues to echo across time, inviting us to look closer, to question, and to wonder. The Merovingians rose from the chaos of a crumbling Roman world, emerging as the rulers of a fractured Gaul, a land of forests, rivers, and scattered settlements. They were kings who claimed divine sanction, a dynasty where legend and blood intertwined, where hair was not merely hair, but a symbol of power, and where every gesture, every ritual, hinted at hidden meanings. To the people of the time, they were not just kings. They were living symbols of continuity, stability, and, some whispered, of something far more sacred than any throne could confer. Yet behind the familiar images of crowned rulers and battlefields lies an enduring question. What made the Merovingians truly powerful, and who ensured the survival of that power when history itself began to blur and erase the women beside them? The chronicles of the early medieval period are filled with the names of Merovingian kings, Clovis, Dagobert, Childeric, but they say little about the women who stood beside them. And yet, these queens were more than companions or decorative figures in courtly tableaus. They were agents of influence in a time when power was fragmented and fragile, when a single death or betrayal could topple entire regions. Their presence was strategic, their actions calculated, and their understanding of political and spiritual networks profound. While the kings were busy consolidating territory, fighting battles, and signing decrees, the queens were navigating a web of alliances, kinship ties, and rivalries that often determined the survival of the dynasty itself. The Merovingian kings cultivated an image of sacred kingship, hair long and flowing. They were said to be chosen by God, and some accounts even suggested a hint of the supernatural in their lineage. But even as these kings basked in the limelight of their apparent divine favor, the real currents of power often flowed elsewhere. Queens arranged marriages that secured peace, brokered alliances that prevented wars, and guided heirs who might otherwise have succumbed to factional violence. In some cases, they even ruled in the absence of a king, acting as regents, arbiters, and decision-makers with the full force of authority, though rarely acknowledged by official chroniclers. Their power was subtle, almost invisible, yet decisive. It is here, in the unseen corridors of influence, that the Merovingian queens emerge as figures of fascination. Take Fredegund, for instance, whose life was a tapestry of cunning and ruthlessness. She maneuvered her way into power, eliminating rivals and consolidating her son's claim to the throne. Or consider Balthild, a queen who had been enslaved before rising to the apex of power, and who used her position to effect social reforms, build monasteries, and influence kings in ways that would echo long after her death. Brunhild, another figure of extraordinary ambition and intelligence, survived political assassinations and conspiracies, leaving a legacy of strength that even chroniclers could not entirely suppress. These women were not exceptions. They were part of a pattern, a hidden system of governance and influence that ran parallel to the rule of kings, quietly steering the dynasty's fate. The allure of the Merovingians has never been merely political. Their bloodline, their rituals, and their sacred symbols inspired awe and speculation alike. Some historians dismissed these claims as exaggeration. Yet esoteric traditions suggest that the queens were the custodians of knowledge, protectors of sacred relics, and interpreters of divine signs. They may have carried secrets that could validate the king's claims, enhance their legitimacy, and maintain the cohesion of the realm. It is a power that is not recorded in chronicles or etched into stone, but one that resonates through fragments of letters, cryptic inscriptions, and the whispered legends preserved in monastic manuscripts. These traces hint at a deeper story, one that defies simple categorization and invites exploration into realms of hidden influence, spiritual authority, and untold wisdom. The contrast between what the records say and what may have occurred is striking. On one hand, the chronicles immortalize battles, coronations, and legal decrees. On the other, they almost entirely ignore the individuals who orchestrated these outcomes behind the scenes. Perhaps it was intentional, a reflection of a patriarchal worldview, or perhaps it was simply the chronicler's fascination with kings and warriors. Whatever the reason, history has left gaps, and it is within these gaps that the hidden queens of Merovingia reside. They are enigmas whose true significance may forever evade precise measurement, yet whose impact can be inferred from the trajectory of the dynasty itself. To truly understand the Merovingians, one must consider not only their public image, but also the silent, potent influence that shaped it. The kingdom of the Franks was not merely a backdrop for royal display. It was a living network of loyalties, feuds, and secret alliances, and the queens were among its most skilled navigators. They understood the subtleties of diplomacy and the nuances of ritual, and they wielded these tools with a precision that rivaled the kings themselves. Their influence extended beyond the political realm into the spiritual, perhaps guiding the interpretation of omens, supervising religious foundations, and safeguarding the sanctity of bloodlines that were believed to be touched by the divine. As we begin to explore the world of the Merovingians in greater depth, it becomes clear that these queens were not mere shadows. They were architects of a hidden order. They existed in a space between visibility and secrecy, where their actions were crucial, but their recognition was limited. In many ways, understanding their role forces us to rethink the very nature of power in early medieval Europe. Power was not only about conquest or legislation. It was about knowledge, strategy, and influence, elements that were often exercised quietly, deliberately, and by those whom history forgot to honor. Thus, as we peer into this hidden world, the Merovingians begin to appear not simply as a dynasty of kings, but as a complex system of governance and mystique in which queens were central actors. They were the silent forces guiding history, the invisible hands shaping the fate of kingdoms, and perhaps even the guardians of a sacred bloodline whose secrets were meant to endure beyond the reach of time. Their story is a story of contrast, between recorded history and hidden truth, between male glory and female agency, and between the seen and the unseen. It is in this liminal space that the true fascination of Merovingia lies, a world waiting to be rediscovered, where the queens who were left in the shadows may finally step into the light of our imagination. History, as it is often told, has a peculiar way of overlooking those who wield power quietly. The queens of Merovingia are perhaps the most striking example. Their lives were not recorded with the same zeal as their husbands, their deeds seldom celebrated in chronicles, and yet, in the quiet corners of courts, abbeys, and even battle councils, they exercised a form of influence that was both subtle and profound. To the chroniclers, their roles may have seemed secondary, almost ornamental, but a closer look reveals a different picture, one of cunning, strategy, and enduring legacy. It is here, in the blind spots of history, that the hidden queens emerge, demanding that we reconsider the very nature of authority in early medieval Europe. These women were born into a world in which power was often inherited through male lines, where kings were lionized for conquest and lawmaking, and where political ambition was measured by the size of an army or the reach of a kingdom. Yet the queens found ways to navigate and even manipulate this male-dominated hierarchy. Marriage was not merely a union of hearts. It was a tool, a calculated move in a larger game of dynastic chess. By choosing allies, fostering relationships with influential clergy, and advising, or sometimes manipulating, the queens wielded a power that could secure the future of a dynasty or save a kingdom from collapse. It was a power that was invisible to the naked, yet indispensable to the machinery of rulership. The erasure of these women from history was not accidental. Chroniclers, often monks writing in monasteries long after the events, prioritized the deeds of men, battles won, and kings crowned. Women were relegated to footnotes or moralizing tales, their true impact disguised as piety, vanity, or ambition. Yet, when pieced together from letters, charters, coinage, and fleeting mentions in annals, a different narrative emerges, one in which queens were not passive observers, but active participants in shaping the destiny of the Merovingian line. Fredegund, for example, is remembered by some as ruthless, even cruel, yet her political acumen kept her son's claim to the throne alive in a time of brutal factional warfare. Balthild, once a slave, transformed herself into a queen whose influence extended across social reforms and religious foundations, leaving an imprint on the kingdom that chroniclers could barely contain. It is important to understand the environment in which these women operated. The Merovingian court was a complex ecosystem of competing interests, secret alliances, and shifting loyalties. Queens had to navigate this landscape with precision. Every gesture, every word, every public appearance carried weight. They acted as intermediaries between nobles, as mediators in disputes, and sometimes as negotiators with foreign powers. In many instances, the success or failure of the king's rule depended on their ability to maintain these delicate balances. Their influence was rarely visible in the public record, yet the evidence of their impact can be traced through the outcomes of political struggles, the survival of heirs, and the stability of the realm. The queens also had a role in shaping the spiritual and symbolic aspects of the monarchy. The Merovingian kings were said to possess a divine quality in their blood, and it was the queens who often acted as custodians of this sacred lineage, ensuring its continuity through careful selection of heirs and adherence to ritual. They oversaw the religious education of their children, commissioned the construction of monasteries, and engaged in acts of piety that reinforced the dynasty's divine legitimacy. These were not merely symbolic acts. They were strategic moves designed to strengthen the dynasty, consolidate influence, and maintain the perception of sacred authority. In this sense, the queens operated at the intersection of power, religion, and myth, crafting a subtle but enduring legacy. Legends and folklore further hint at their hidden roles. Stories passed down through generations, sometimes recorded in cryptic monastic writings, suggest that these queens were far more than consorts. They were advisors, arbiters, and, in some cases, power brokers in their own right. They were involved in intelligence gathering, diplomacy, and even military planning. Their agency was hidden by necessity, for overt power by a woman in a patriarchal society could be deemed dangerous, scandalous, or even heretical. Thus, the Merovingian queens mastered the art of influence without visibility, shaping events from behind the scenes while remaining largely unacknowledged in official history. The pattern of historical omission raises important questions. Why were these women so thoroughly erased from the chronicles? Was it a deliberate act to protect male authority, or simply the result of societal norms that undervalued female power? Perhaps it was a combination of both. The silence of history, however, is not proof of absence. On the contrary, it is in this very silence that the story of the hidden queens is most compelling. Every subtle manipulation, every quiet intervention, every strategic act becomes magnified in its significance precisely because it was left unrecorded, invisible to those who would later write the official narrative. In piecing together their stories, we begin to see a world where power was far more nuanced than the sweeping tales of conquest suggest. It was a world where queens acted as the connective tissue of dynastic survival, where influence was measured in subtle gestures and hidden decisions, and where the survival of the sacred Merovingian bloodline may have rested as much in the hands of women as in those of kings. Their lives remind us that history is rarely linear or straightforward. It is a tapestry of recorded deeds, forgotten acts, and hidden interventions, all interwoven into a narrative that often obscures as much as it reveals. As we delve further into the hidden histories of Merovingia, it becomes clear that these queens were not merely bystanders in their own time. They were active agents, whose legacies, though partially concealed, ripple through the centuries. Their influence challenges conventional understandings of power, authority, and historical memory. And in recognizing their presence, we begin to uncover a more complete, more complex, and far more fascinating story. A story where the women of Merovingia were not merely shadows, but the architects of the dynasty's enduring mystery. Among the most enduring mysteries of the Merovingians is the question of their bloodline. Legends, whispered in the dark corridors of monasteries and echoed in obscure manuscripts, speak of a lineage unlike any other, a line touched, perhaps, by the divine, a line that carried with it not only political authority, but a sacred, almost mystical significance. The kings themselves were described as possessing a certain aura, their long hair a symbol of power, their very presence imbued with a sense of destiny. It was not just the kings who were central to this mythos. The queens, as many esoteric traditions suggest, may have been the true guardians of the secret of the bloodline, protectors of knowledge and power that could alter the fate of kingdoms if revealed. The idea of a sacred or dangerous bloodline is not unique to the Merovingians. Throughout history, ruling families have often been associated with divine favor or mystical origins, and the Merovingians were no exception. Chroniclers, both contemporary and later, noted their divine right, hinting at a lineage that was more than merely political. But these accounts were often vague, leaving space for speculation, legend, and conspiracy. What exactly made the bloodline sacred? Was it divine selection, a secret ritual, or perhaps knowledge passed down through generations of women, carefully safeguarded against those who might misuse it? The answers are elusive, but the hints are tantalizing. The queens of Merovingia, it seems, were not merely ornamental in this sacred framework. They were central to its preservation. In a world where lineage determined not only who ruled, but who held legitimacy in the eyes of God, the queen's role in producing, guiding, and protecting heirs was of paramount importance. Their influence extended beyond the personal or domestic. It was deeply political and deeply mystical. Some historians suggest that the queens acted as keepers of hidden rites, overseeing ceremonies, blessings, and rituals that maintained the sanctity of the royal line. Their wisdom, their knowledge of timing, ancestry, and propriety ensured that the bloodline remained pure in both the social and spiritual sense, a task whose consequences were potentially monumental. Yet, the sacred nature of the bloodline also made it dangerous. Rivals coveted it, enemies sought to disrupt it, and those outside the inner circle were largely unaware of its significance. Queens may have been the first line of defense, ensuring that heirs were protected, marriages were arranged strategically, and dangerous knowledge did not fall into the wrong hands. In some accounts, their influence is hinted at in the quiet recording of events. A king preserved, a rival neutralized, a child safeguarded. The subtlety of their power allowed them to operate under the radar, maintaining control over a force that could otherwise destabilize entire kingdoms. Adding to the intrigue are the esoteric interpretations that arose centuries later, linking the Merovingian bloodline to sacred relics and hidden knowledge. Some theorists suggest that the queens were custodians of information about a divine artifact, a relic whose significance was intertwined with their children's claim to divine favor. Others posit that the bloodline itself was thought to hold mystical properties, a living conduit of sacred energy, with the queens acting as the protectors of this living power. Whether through ritual, spiritual guidance, or the careful orchestration of political alliances, The queens were tasked with a responsibility that was as dangerous as it was sacred, a responsibility that could alter the course of history itself. The tension between historical skepticism and esoteric speculation only heightens the mystery. Mainstream historians often dismiss the more extravagant claims as legend, attributing them to the exaggerations of chroniclers or the imaginations of later storytellers. Yet the consistency of these hints, scattered across centuries, cannot be ignored entirely. Coins, inscriptions, and the architecture of abbeys suggest a deliberate effort to codify influence, to memorialize the presence of women whose role in preserving the bloodline was vital. Even if the full truth is obscured by time, the patterns remain, a subtle but persistent evidence of female agency in the heart of Merovingian power. One of the most compelling aspects of this mystery is the way it positions the queens not just as participants in politics, but as custodians of a secret history. Their power was not always visible in the public eye, yet it was potent. They mediated conflicts, guided heirs, and perhaps even performed rituals whose purpose is now lost to us. The very idea of a sacred bloodline carries with it the notion that knowledge, power, and legitimacy are inseparable, and that the queens were the linchpins holding these forces together. To understand the Merovingians fully, one must therefore consider the queens not as secondary figures, but as the true architects of continuity, the invisible hands ensuring that the lineage endured and that its secrets remained intact. In exploring the bloodline, one cannot avoid the darker side of its legacy. The same sacredness that elevated the Merovingians also made them targets. Assassinations, betrayals, and conspiracies were common, and queens were often at the center of these intrigues. Their ability to survive, to manipulate, and to protect the heirs of the bloodline speaks to both their intelligence and their courage. They operated in a world where one misstep could result in death or the destruction of the lineage they were sworn to protect. In this sense, the sacred and the dangerous were inseparable, and the queen's influence was both a shield and a sword. As we continue to peel back the layers of history, it becomes increasingly clear that the story of the Merovingian bloodline is inseparable from the story of the queens. Without them, the line may have fractured, its mysteries lost forever. With them, it endured, shrouded in secrecy, intertwined with legend, and preserved with meticulous care. The queens of Merovingia were not merely witnesses to history. They were the stewards of a secret that spanned generations, a secret that could shape kingdoms, influence beliefs, and perhaps even touch the divine. Their legacy is one of quiet power, hidden influence, and enduring mystery, a legacy that invites us to look deeper, question more, and imagine the unseen forces that shaped a world long past, yet still echoing through the corridors of legend and memory. The history of Merovingia is often framed by kings, Clovis, Childeric, Dagobert, but behind their public displays of power, behind the grandeur of crowns and the parade of armies, there were queens who wielded influence with a subtlety that was both remarkable and dangerous. These women did not command legions on the battlefield, nor did they always issue decrees in their own names. Yet their decisions often had consequences as profound as any conquest. They were the unseen architects of dynastic survival, the quiet strategists who ensured that the Merovingian line not only endured but thrived amidst chaos, intrigue, and ambition. Consider Fredegund, perhaps the most notorious of these hidden queens. Born into uncertain circumstances, her ascent to power was neither straightforward nor gentle. She maneuvered through court intrigues, survived assassination attempts, and manipulated alliances with precision that rivals the most cunning of her male contemporaries. Her reputation among chroniclers is mixed. Some call her ruthless, others call her politically brilliant, but beneath the surface lies a woman who understood the mechanisms of power in a society that often sought to marginalize her. Every calculated move she made, whether eliminating a rival or securing her son's claim to the throne, was a testament to her ability to wield influence quietly yet decisively. She operated in shadows, yet her impact was visible in the stability of her son's reign, the survival of her allies, and the enduring presence of her lineage. Baldhild presents a striking contrast. Captured as a slave and brought into the court, she rose to become one of the most respected queens in Merovingian history. Unlike Fredegund, whose power was often exercised through fear and political cunning, Baldhild's influence lay in strategy, piety, and long-term vision. She championed social reforms, oversaw the construction of monasteries, and guided the moral and political education of her children. Her actions reinforced the dynasty's sacred image while simultaneously shaping the social and spiritual landscape of the kingdom. It is said that her influence extended far beyond the court. She created networks of loyalty and devotion that secured the dynasty's stability for generations. Her story exemplifies a form of power that is quiet yet transformative, a power that leaves traces not in grand battles, but in enduring social and spiritual structures. Brunhild, another formidable queen, demonstrates yet another dimension of influence. Known for her political acumen, military involvement, and unyielding will, she survived assassinations, conspiracies, and civil wars, maintaining her authority in a court rife with factional strife. Her life was a continuous negotiation of power, and her ability to manipulate alliances and navigate the treacherous waters of Merovingian politics reflects a level of agency often denied to women in historical accounts. Brunhild's story is a vivid illustration of how queens could operate simultaneously in public and behind-the-scenes spheres, shaping the kingdom's trajectory through strategy, diplomacy, and sheer willpower. The patterns that emerge from the lives of these queens reveal a form of influence that is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Their power was exercised in private councils, in whispered conversations, in careful supervision of heirs and allies. They understood the importance of appearances, the weight of symbolism, and the subtlety of timing. A queen could alter the course of a treaty with a word, prevent a rebellion with a well-placed marriage, or secure loyalty through acts of generosity and patronage. Their influence was both political and symbolic. It extended into the realm of the sacred, as they often acted as the custodians of dynastic rituals, sacred relics, and ceremonial rites. In essence, they maintained the invisible threads that held the dynasty together. This hidden power was further reinforced by their control over succession and bloodline. In a world where legitimacy could be challenged and heirs could be threatened, queens had a profound role in ensuring continuity. Their oversight of heirs, involvement in selecting consorts, and guidance of dynastic education were not minor matters. They were essential to the survival of the Merovingian legacy. By preserving the sanctity and continuity of the bloodline, queens were, in effect, the guardians of the kingdom itself. Without their intervention, the fate of the dynasty could have been far less certain, and the political landscape of Europe might have shifted dramatically. Yet, despite their importance, history often marginalizes these women. Chronicles prefer to record the grandeur of kings and the drama of wars, while the subtler strategies of queens fade into obscurity. And yet, the fragments that remain, a charter signed in a queen's name, a reference in a monk's manuscript, a coin depicting her visage, reveal a hidden narrative of cunning, strategy, and enduring influence. They remind us that power does not always announce itself with swords and crowns. Sometimes, it moves silently through whispers, guidance, and careful orchestration. In this way, the Merovingian queens were not just participants in history, they were its unseen architects. The contrast between the visible and the hidden is what makes their stories so compelling. Where kings are remembered for public deeds, queens are remembered in echoes, subtle yet persistent, shaping events in ways that often go unnoticed. They were not merely reactive. They were proactive, anticipating threats, orchestrating alliances, and guiding the dynasty's course with foresight and precision. Their stories challenge our assumptions about power, revealing a world in which influence was not always exercised in plain sight, and where those who appeared to be in control were, in many ways, guided by the hidden hands of women. By examining the lives of Fredegund, Balthild, Brunhild, and others like them, we begin to appreciate the complexity of Merovingian politics and society. The queens were far from passive consorts. They were strategic thinkers, spiritual guides, and political operatives, operating in an era where every decision carried profound consequences. Their influence was pervasive, enduring, and often decisive, shaping not only the course of individual reigns, but the trajectory of the dynasty itself. In their stories, we glimpse a world where women's power was not absent. It was concealed, deliberate, and formidable. It is a world that history has too often overlooked, but one whose legacy continues to intrigue, inspire, and mystify. Across the landscapes of early medieval Gaul, in the forests, rivers, and valleys that the Merovingians once ruled, there exist subtle traces of a hidden history, traces that hint at the silent power of the queens who shaped the dynasty. These are not grand monuments or battlefields recorded in chronicles, but sites imbued with quiet significance, where the intersection of politics, ritual, and legend becomes palpable. Abbeys founded by queens, secluded chapels, cryptic inscriptions on stone, and even the alignment of burial sites suggest that women of the Merovingian line left a deliberate mark on the land, a testament to their influence that endured long after their names were marginalized in official records. Walking these lands today, one can almost sense the resonance of power that once flowed through them, a power that was carefully preserved and subtly asserted. Consider the abbeys and monasteries constructed under the patronage of queens, such as Balthild. These were not simply religious acts of piety. They were calculated demonstrations of influence and control. Monasteries functioned as centers of both spiritual authority and political communication. By founding, funding, or influencing these institutions, queens could extend their reach far beyond the immediate confines of the court. Monks and scribes within these sacred spaces often recorded not only religious texts, but also events, genealogies, and social dynamics, sometimes encoding the queen's role in subtle ways that would evade later historian scrutiny. The architecture itself, the placement of buildings, the design of altars, and the inscriptions carved into stone, often bore hidden symbolism, referencing dynastic continuity, sacred bloodlines, or protective rituals associated with the queen's authority. The placement and orientation of certain burial sites further hint at hidden networks of female power. While kings were typically buried with pomp and ceremony, some queens appear to have chosen locations that linked them to sacred landscapes, natural features, or even earlier dynasties. These choices were not accidental. Aligning tombs with rivers, forests, or celestial patterns could convey a spiritual message, a claim to legitimacy, or an assertion of continued influence beyond death. The physical space became a silent testament to the queen's role in sustaining the dynasty, a form of power that could not be easily erased by chroniclers or rival factions. Even coins and artifacts offer subtle clues to the presence of queens' influence. While kings' images dominated currency, a rare coin bearing a queen's likeness or name suggests deliberate acknowledgement of her authority. Jewelry, ceremonial objects, and personal relics commissioned by or associated with queens often contained hidden symbols, crosses, geometric patterns, or enigmatic marks that may have encoded their role in dynastic or sacred matters. These objects were not merely decorative. They served as portable symbols of influence, reinforcing the queen's authority in a tangible, lasting form. In some cases, the meaning of these symbols has been lost to time, leaving modern observers to speculate about their significance. Yet the consistent recurrence of such artifacts suggests intention rather than coincidence. Sacred sites, too, often intersected with legends of hidden knowledge. Some monasteries or chapels were rumored to house secret texts, relics, or prophecies safeguarded by the queens or their trusted attendants. These sites were both spiritual and political, functioning as centers where the queens could exercise influence indirectly. Pilgrimages to these locations, offerings made in their honor, and rituals performed under their patronage created networks of loyalty and devotion that reinforced the dynasty's continuity. In a society where literacy was rare and oral tradition strong, the careful management of sacred spaces allowed queens to maintain authority, shape public perception, and guide events with subtle, far-reaching consequences. Maps of Merovingian lands, when examined closely, reveal yet another layer of hidden influence. Certain regions appear repeatedly in connection with queens, either through ownership of estates, the location of abbeys, or the proximity to strategic trade routes. These areas were not simply convenient. They were symbolic and strategic, chosen to maintain control, project power, or protect heirs and sacred relics. Even today, these locations retain a sense of quiet authority, as if the land itself remembers the women who once walked there, quietly orchestrating the fate of kingdoms from behind the veil of history. The queen's relationship with sacred symbols extends beyond tangible sites and artifacts. Some historians suggest that the queens were involved in interpreting omens, celestial events, or ritual practices tied to the dynasty's legitimacy. Certain motifs in manuscripts, carvings, or even coins may have encoded messages about dynastic succession or spiritual protection, understood only by those within the inner circle of power. In this way, the queens acted as intermediaries between the sacred and the temporal, bridging the gap between divine authority and political governance. Their influence was thus both practical and symbolic, encompassing the spiritual, the strategic, and the ceremonial. What is striking is the deliberate and consistent nature of these traces. Across different regions and generations, queens appear to have exercised similar forms of influence, founding religious institutions, placing tombs with intention, commissioning symbolic artifacts, and orchestrating sacred rituals. This suggests a conscious strategy, a hidden framework of power maintained over decades, perhaps centuries, by women whose names were often forgotten, but whose actions shaped the dynasty's survival. Even when chroniclers ignored or minimized their contributions, the landscape, artifacts, and architecture continued to tell a story, waiting for those who would recognize its significance. In exploring these sites and symbols, one begins to see that the queen's influence was both pervasive and enduring. They were not merely participants in the political and spiritual life of Merovingia. They were its custodians, ensuring that power, legitimacy, and sacred knowledge were preserved across generations. Their impact is etched into stone, carved into manuscripts, and woven into the land itself. It is a power that transcends time, subtle yet undeniable, leaving a legacy that invites modern observers to look beyond the written record and into the hidden networks of influence that defined an era. The story of the hidden queens is therefore inseparable from the landscapes they shaped, the symbols they commissioned, and the sacred spaces they safeguarded. To walk through Merovingian lands is to walk through history unseen, guided by the quiet, deliberate hand of women whose power was profound, invisible, and enduring. And in these places, one can almost feel the echo of their influence, a whisper of authority that has survived centuries of erasure, waiting to be recognized, explored, and understood. In the dim glow of candlelight, the scribes of Merovingian monasteries recorded tales of kings and battles. But occasionally, hidden within the margins and the folds of scripture, appear references to women whose influence transcended the ordinary. These are not always straightforward accounts. They are veiled, cryptic, and often wrapped in a language of prophecy, omens, and divine vision. The queens of Merovingia occupied a liminal space between history and legend, their power partially concealed by the very culture that relied on them. It is here, in these whispered fragments, that the mystical dimension of their authority becomes apparent, a dimension in which foresight, spiritual guidance, and hidden wisdom intersect with the political and the temporal. Prophecies, whether documented in parchment or passed down through oral tradition, frequently reference the continuity of the royal line, often through subtle mentions of women. These queens, it is suggested, were not merely observers of fate, but active participants in its unfolding. Certain manuscripts hint at women interpreting celestial signs, reading omens in the flight of birds, or understanding the significance of eclipses and comets. These were not trivial pursuits. In a world where kingship was intertwined with divine favor, interpreting such signs could influence decisions of war, succession, and governance. Queens who mastered this knowledge wielded a quiet yet profound power, guiding the dynasty's actions through an understanding of the mystical as much as the political. Some of the most fascinating examples come from the accounts of saintly visions or prophetic writings, where queens appear as intermediaries between the earthly and the divine. These texts often describe a queen who advises a king, protects a sacred relic, or oversees rituals designed to maintain the sanctity of the royal bloodline. The language is allegorical, the imagery dense with symbolism, but the underlying message is consistent. These women were entrusted with knowledge that was crucial to the survival of the dynasty and the preservation of divine favor. In a society that venerated kings for their apparent divine right, the queen's hidden stewardship of spiritual and mystical traditions suggests a form of influence that was both subtle and extraordinary. It is also striking how these mystical references intersect with historical events. Certain prophecies appear to coincide with moments of crisis, assassinations, succession disputes, or territorial conflicts. The queen's presence in these accounts implies that they were involved in the resolution of these crises, whether through counsel, ritual, or strategic alliances. Their agency was masked in the allegorical language of prophecy, a protective mechanism that shielded both them and the secrets they guarded from potential adversaries. By operating within the realm of the mystical, they could exert influence without drawing the scrutiny of chroniclers who might have been unwilling or unable to acknowledge female authority in the temporal sphere. Folklore further enhances this sense of hidden power. Across regions once ruled by the Merovingians, stories persist of queens who could see the future, who communicated with saints, or who were guided by visions that determined the fate of the kingdom. These tales, passed down through generations, often blur the line between historical fact and legend, yet their consistency suggests a kernel of truth. The queen's ability to navigate both the political and the spiritual realms made them formidable figures, capable of shaping events in ways that kings and generals alone could not. Their authority was reinforced by the belief in their mystical insight, creating a feedback loop in which perception and power reinforced one another. This intertwining of prophecy and female agency also raises questions about the preservation of knowledge. Certain texts hint at secret teachings, perhaps ritual instructions or esoteric wisdom, transmitted from one queen to another across generations. These teachings may have been deliberately encoded in symbolic language, accessible only to those initiated into the inner circle of the dynasty. By controlling access to this knowledge, queens ensured that the sacred bloodline remained protected and that its divine legitimacy could not be easily challenged. In effect, the mystical dimension of their authority functioned as both shield and sword, safeguarding the dynasty while subtly shaping the course of history. Even in the absence of direct documentation, the patterns are evident. Queens are associated with key religious foundations, patronage of mystical texts, and the supervision of heirs who carried the sacred bloodline. Their involvement in prophecy and spiritual guidance reinforced their practical political influence, allowing them to act in concert with kings while maintaining a layer of autonomy. They were the custodians of hidden wisdom, the interpreters of divine will, and the silent architects of dynastic continuity. Without them, the Merovingian line might have faltered, and the legends that surround it today may have taken a very different shape. Perhaps most intriguing is the way these mystical references invite reinterpretation of history itself. The queen's presence in prophecy and legend challenges the traditional focus on kingship as the sole locus of power. By considering the spiritual, mystical, and hidden dimensions of influence, we begin to see a more nuanced picture of Merovingian society, a society in which authority was multifaceted, where women wielded power that was at once practical, symbolic, and sacred. The interplay between prophecy, legend, and political reality reveals a sophisticated system in which queens could operate simultaneously in the public and hidden spheres, shaping events with a combination of foresight, strategy, and spiritual insight. In contemplating these queens and their mystical roles, one is left with a sense of awe at the complexity of their influence. They were far more than consorts. They were interpreters of fate, guardians of sacred knowledge, and silent architects of dynastic survival. The prophecies and legends that reference them offer tantalizing glimpses into a world where power was not only wielded in courtly councils or on battlefields, but also in the unseen, ethereal realms of vision, ritual, and divine insight. Their stories are not easily separated from myth. Yet within these myths lies a profound truth. The Merovingian queens were custodians of secrets, mediators of divine will, and active participants in a history that has too often been told without them. Among the many legends that surround the Merovingians, few are as enduring or as enigmatic as the connection to the Holy Grail. This is not merely a tale of kings and knights. It is a story that intertwines sacred bloodlines, secret knowledge, and the quiet power of the queens who safeguarded it. The Grail, in its many interpretations, has long symbolized purity, divine favor, and hidden wisdom. For the Merovingians, some theorists suggest it was less an artifact to be sought on perilous quests and more a representation of their sacred lineage, a mystical inheritance that the queens were charged to protect, interpret, and preserve. To understand the Grail in the context of Merovingia, one must look beyond the familiar medieval romances to the hidden currents of power that flowed through royal households, guided by women whose influence was largely invisible to chroniclers of the time. The notion that the Merovingian bloodline itself was sacred provides the foundation for this connection. Kings were said to carry divine right in their veins, a legitimacy derived not solely from conquest or election, but from an almost mystical ancestry. Yet it was the queens who ensured that this line remained intact, carefully selecting marriages, overseeing heirs, and preserving rituals that maintained the sanctity of the dynasty. In this framework, the Grail becomes a symbol of continuity, a metaphor for the divine power encoded within the bloodline, and a representation of knowledge that was entrusted to the queens. It was their duty to safeguard this legacy, to ensure that the mystical and political dimensions of their dynasty remained secure against internal and external threats alike. Historical records provide tantalizing, if fragmented, clues. Some accounts suggest that certain relics, ceremonial objects, or secret texts were associated with Merovingian queens, entrusted to them alone. These items, often referenced only cryptically in charters or monastic manuscripts, hint at a hidden network of power and knowledge. They suggest that the queens were not merely guardians of physical artifacts, but also custodians of esoteric wisdom, rituals, and symbolic truths. This aligns with later traditions and speculative interpretations linking the Merovingians to the Grail, in which the sacred lineage itself is viewed as the ultimate treasure, one that could not be touched, seen, or taken by outsiders, but only protected, nurtured, and transmitted through blood and guidance. The Grail legend, as we know it from medieval literature, often portrays knights embarking on dangerous quests in search of a chalice or a sacred cup. But in the context of Merovingia, the quest was already embedded in the royal household, internal and ongoing, with queens at the helm. Their power was exercised through vigilance, wisdom, and subtle orchestration. They ensured that heirs were trained in ways that preserved both the dynastic legacy and the sanctity of the bloodline. They acted as intermediaries between the visible authority of kings and the unseen forces of tradition, ritual, and mystical knowledge. In doing so, they became living symbols of the Grail itself, repositories of sacred authority, essential yet invisible, and capable of influencing history through quiet stewardship. The idea of the Grail also intersects with the broader theme of secrecy and preservation. In a turbulent period of European history, where assassination, rebellion, and dynastic rivalry were constant threats, safeguarding a sacred bloodline was a high-stakes endeavor. Queens who understood this responsibility operated with intelligence, caution, and foresight. Their authority was often invisible to contemporaries, yet decisive in determining who lived, who inherited power, and how the symbolic and spiritual legacy of the dynasty was maintained. The Grail, in this sense, becomes both a symbol and a mechanism, a metaphor for the sacred continuity entrusted to women who knew how to wield it without drawing attention to their power. The persistence of Grail legends in later centuries, intertwined with speculation about Merovingian bloodlines, suggests that these stories were not entirely fabrications. They are a cultural echo of a reality in which certain knowledge, influence, and authority were intentionally concealed, transmitted through female lines, and safeguarded with meticulous care. Whether viewed through the lens of mythology, esoteric tradition, or historical interpretation, the Grail's connection to the queens of Merovingia illuminates a dimension of power that is largely absent from conventional chronicles, one in which women were custodians of both the spiritual and political essence of the dynasty, shaping history from behind the veil of secrecy. It is worth noting that this Grail connection is often controversial, blending documented history with speculation, legend, and later reinterpretation. Some scholars dismiss it as romanticized myth-making, while others argue that the consistency of the motifs, the sacred bloodline, the queens as custodians, the secret rituals, points to something more substantive. Even if the literal existence of a Grail is debatable, the metaphorical interpretation offers profound insight into the queen's role. They were protectors of sacred knowledge, mediators of divine legitimacy, and guardians of the continuity that defined Merovingian authority. In this sense, the Grail legend may be less about an object and more about the women who carried the legacy of the dynasty through careful, deliberate action. By connecting the Grail to the hidden queens, we begin to see a richer, more layered picture of Merovingian history. The dynasty was not merely a succession of kings. It was a living network of relationships, rituals, and custodianship, in which female authority played a central yet concealed role. The Grail serves as a lens through which to view this hidden dimension, highlighting the importance of women in sustaining the spiritual, political, and symbolic integrity of the bloodline. Through their vigilance, intelligence, and subtle orchestration, the queens ensured that the sacred essence of the dynasty endured, protected from the tumult of external threats and internal ambitions alike. Ultimately, the Grail connection underscores a key theme: that power and sacredness are not always obvious, and that influence can be wielded in silence, through careful guardianship and deliberate action. The queens of Merovingia embody this principle, operating at the intersection of legend, history, and mysticism. Their legacy invites us to reconsider not only the Merovingians themselves, but the broader nature of authority, secrecy, an inheritance in medieval Europe. The Grail, whether literal or symbolic, is a testament to the hidden power of these women. Women whose wisdom, foresight, and guardianship shaped the destiny of a dynasty, and whose stories continue to captivate and mystify to this day. The story of the Merovingians is not one of unchallenged power. Their dominance, like that of any dynasty, was constantly tested by rival families, competing factions, and ambitious nobles. Yet within these struggles, the role of queens often went unnoticed or deliberately obscured. These women operated in a world where their influence could be contested not only by men outside the dynasty, but also by chroniclers who favored male authority. Rivals sought to undermine the Merovingians, and part of that effort involved erasing or marginalizing the women who protected, guided, and sustained the line. The queen's power was subtle, strategic, and often invisible, making it all the more threatening to outsiders who depended on conventional power structures. Political rivalry in early medieval Europe was brutal. Kings were assassinated, territories seized, and alliances constantly shifted. Within this context, queens acted as stabilizers and strategists, managing threats that might otherwise have destabilized the dynasty. They could broker alliances with neighboring kingdoms, negotiate truces, and orchestrate marriages that neutralized potential enemies. Their influence extended beyond domestic politics. They were crucial in safeguarding the integrity of the bloodline and ensuring the survival of heirs who represented the dynasty's future. In many cases, a single queen's intervention could prevent civil war or avert the collapse of entire regions. Yet history often credits the king alone, leaving the queen's contribution invisible. Rival dynasties recognized the threat posed by these hidden powers. The queen's ability to maneuver behind the scenes, control key alliances, and safeguard sacred knowledge made them formidable adversaries. Chroniclers aligned with rival factions occasionally hinted at this influence, often casting it in a negative light. Queens were portrayed as manipulative, ambitious, or even dangerous, a reflection not of their moral character, but of the threat their intelligence and agency posed to male-dominated hierarchies. Such depictions serve as evidence of the quiet power these women wielded. If they had been inconsequential, there would have been no need to malign them. The deliberate suppression of female influence extended into written records and official histories. Monastic chroniclers, often commissioned by male successors or rival dynasties, had little incentive to acknowledge queens as power brokers. They were more interested in glorifying kings, legitimizing political authority, and reinforcing societal norms that favored male rule. In doing so, they effectively erased or minimized the contributions of women, leaving us with a partial and often distorted view of history. Yet the very gaps, inconsistencies, and contradictions in these chronicles are clues, pointing toward the hidden networks of influence exercised by queens who remained unseen by the official record. This suppression was not limited to contemporary chroniclers. It extended into folklore, legend, and the collective memory of the regions once under Merovingian control. Over time, the deeds of queens were either attributed to kings, transformed into moral tales of piety or virtue, or forgotten entirely. Yet traces remain. Fragments of correspondence, legal documents, coins, and inscriptions hint at their strategic involvement. These remnants, though scattered and cryptic, reveal a consistent pattern of agency, foresight, and authority. Even when deliberately erased from the narrative, the queen's influence left tangible imprints on the political and spiritual structures of their time. One of the most striking aspects of this suppression is its relationship to the protection of sacred knowledge. If, as some sources suggest, the Merovingian bloodline held mystical or divine significance, then the queen's roles in preserving that lineage would have been seen as both essential and threatening. Rival dynasties would have recognized that controlling the kings was insufficient. To fully assert dominance, they would need to neutralize the women who safeguarded succession, interpreted omens, and maintained sacred rituals. Erasure from the historical record, coupled with political marginalization, became a tool not just of social control, but of strategic advantage. By undermining the queen's visibility, rivals sought to weaken the invisible architecture of Merovingian power. Yet the queens endured, often outmaneuvering their opponents with patience, intelligence, and subtlety. Fredegund, Balthild, and Brunhild are prime examples. Each faced threats not only from external rivals, but from factions within the court itself. Yet they navigated these dangers with skill. Their strategies were multifaceted. They balanced alliances, leveraged loyalty, and manipulated perception to maintain authority without overt confrontation. This ability to operate effectively within constraints imposed by rivals and social norms underscores the sophistication of their political acumen and highlights why rival dynasties found them so threatening. The tension between visibility and invisibility is central to understanding the queen's role. While kings were celebrated publicly, the queen's power often manifested in quiet interventions, discreet negotiations, and carefully orchestrated networks of influence. Rival dynasties may have seen only the surface, the ostensible authority of the king, while the real levers of control remained hidden. This duality allowed queens to exert influence across generations, shaping succession, policy, and even religious practice while avoiding direct confrontation that could be fatal. Their resilience and strategic foresight ensured that, even in the face of deliberate suppression, their legacy endured. In considering the impact of rival dynasties on the Merovingian queens, it becomes clear that their invisibility was both imposed and strategic. They were erased from chronicles to diminish their perceived authority, yet their quiet, deliberate actions preserved the dynasty in ways that were often unrecognized. Their power was exercised in shadows, yet its effects were tangible, influencing outcomes that shaped the course of European history. The suppression of female influence, far from negating their role, highlights the threat these women posed and the sophistication with which they protected their lineage and their legacy. Ultimately, the story of the queens facing rival dynasties is one of resilience, intelligence, and subtle mastery. They navigated political intrigue, survived threats, and safeguarded both sacred and temporal power in a world that often sought to erase them. Their influence, though obscured by the deliberate suppression of history, remains detectable in the survival of the Merovingian line, the strategic outcomes they orchestrated, and the enduring legends that hint at their true significance. In examining these rivalries, we begin to appreciate not only the challenges they faced, but the extraordinary skill with which they maintained authority, ensuring that the hidden power of Merovingia continued to shape history, often from behind the veil of invisibility. In the intricate web of Merovingian power, succession was far from straightforward. The line of kings was constantly threatened by premature deaths, rival claims, and the fragile loyalties of nobles. It was here at the delicate intersection of bloodline, politics, and prophecy that the queens exercised some of their most vital influence. Their role in orchestrating succession was both subtle and decisive. They oversaw the upbringing of heirs, ensured the continuity of the sacred bloodline, and mediated disputes that might otherwise have torn the dynasty apart. In a period when kings could rise and fall with alarming speed, the queen's foresight and strategic planning often determined whether the dynasty endured or fragmented. From the moment an heir was born, the queens were intimately involved in shaping their future. They guided education, supervised religious instruction, and cultivated alliances that would secure the child's position. The emphasis on the sacred nature of the bloodline added layers of complexity to their responsibilities. It was not enough for an heir to survive physically. The child had to embody legitimacy, virtue, and divine favor. Queens acted as custodians of this delicate balance, protecting the heir from both external threats and internal rivalries. Their vigilance was constant, their interventions often invisible, yet the consequences of their actions were monumental. Consider the historical example of Fredegund. Her son, Clotho II, inherited the throne under circumstances fraught with danger and instability. Fredegund's political acumen and relentless strategic planning ensured that he not only survived assassination attempts, but also consolidated his claim over a fragmented kingdom. Her influence extended far beyond maternal concern. It was a calculated orchestration of alliances, eliminations of rivals, and subtle maneuvering that safeguarded the continuity of the Merovingian line. This example highlights the critical role queens played in succession. They were the architects behind the throne, the invisible hand shaping who would inherit power and how the kingdom would endure. The orchestration of succession also extended to the management of marriages and alliances. Queens carefully selected partners for their children, forging connections that reinforced political stability, secured borders, and neutralized potential threats. These unions were not merely social or ceremonial. They were tactical decisions with long-term consequences. By controlling the network of marital alliances, queens influenced the political landscape across generations, ensuring that the dynasty's influence remained resilient even amidst turbulence. In this sense, the succession was less about individual kings and more about the continuity of a carefully curated system, maintained and protected by the queens. Beyond practical politics, there was a mystical dimension to succession. The sacred bloodline, often tied to divine favor and prophetic legitimacy, required careful preservation. Queens may have overseen rituals, blessings, and ceremonies designed to reinforce the sanctity of heirs, ensuring that the perception of divine legitimacy remained intact. These acts were subtle yet potent, operating in tandem with the more visible strategies of diplomacy and alliance building. In this dual role, as political guardian and spiritual steward, the queens navigated both the earthly and the sacred, maintaining the integrity of the dynasty in ways that were largely unrecorded but no less crucial. The stakes of succession were perilously high. Rival factions, ambitious nobles, and external kingdoms all had incentives to disrupt the line of inheritance. The queen's interventions were often preventive rather than reactive, anticipating threats and neutralizing them before they could manifest. This required intelligence, foresight, and a keen understanding of human behavior, as well as mastery of ceremonial and symbolic power. By maintaining vigilance over heirs, orchestrating marriages, and ensuring continuity through ritual, the queens operated as the ultimate safeguard against the collapse of the dynasty. Even in cases where kings appeared to act independently, the queen's influence was rarely absent. They were advisors, mentors, and protectors, shaping decisions from childhood into adulthood. Their guidance ensured that heirs were not only physically secure, but politically competent and spiritually legitimate. The continuity of Merovingian rule was thus a product not only of conquest and military strength, but of careful preparation, strategy, and the quiet, enduring influence of women whose agency was systematically erased from most historical records. The succession of kings, it seems, was as much a story of maternal strategy as of male heroism. The legacy of this hidden stewardship is evident in the resilience of the dynasty. Despite the chaos of early medieval Europe, wars, assassinations, and shifting allegiances, the Merovingian line persisted, passing through generations in a manner that suggests deliberate planning and careful protection. The queen's ability to safeguard heirs, orchestrate alliances, and ensure the sacred continuity of bloodlines allowed the dynasty to navigate crises that might have destroyed other royal houses. Their influence was a silent force, shaping history from behind the scenes, yet its impact was profound and enduring. In examining the succession secrets of Merovingia, it becomes clear that queens were indispensable architects of dynastic survival. They were strategists, spiritual guides, and guardians of legitimacy, operating at the nexus of power, prophecy, and politics. Their interventions were subtle, often invisible, yet they determined the trajectory of the dynasty and ensured the continuity of sacred authority. The story of Merovingian succession is therefore inseparable from the story of the queens, whose wisdom and foresight allowed a fragile and contested line to endure through generations, leaving a legacy that resonates in legend, history, and the hidden currents of European memory. Ultimately, the orchestration of heirs by the queens reveals a central truth about Merovingian power. Authority was not simply about kingship, battles, or public decrees. It was about preservation, subtlety, and the careful management of continuity across generations. The queens, working in shadows yet shaping destinies, ensured that the sacred line endured, that the dynasty survived threats both internal and external, and that the legacy of Merovingia would echo far beyond their time. Their story, hidden from the chronicles yet woven into the very fabric of the dynasty, is a testament to the power of foresight, strategy, and the quiet but decisive influence of women who controlled history from behind the veil. For centuries, the story of the Merovingian dynasty has been filtered through two powerful lenses: the rising authority of the Frankish Church and the political ambitions of the Carolingian rulers who eventually replaced the long-haired kings. Together, these institutions shaped a historical narrative that favored certain figures while burying others under layers of silence. And few were buried more thoroughly than the Merovingian queens. To understand how and why these women vanished from mainstream history, one must look closely at the shifting balance of power in early medieval Europe. The church was not yet the unchallenged monolith it would become in later centuries. It was still establishing its foothold, constructing its doctrines, securing its influence, asserting moral authority, and negotiating alliances with secular leaders. The Merovingian queens, with their spiritual roles, prophetic reputations, and political sway, represented both a valuable resource and a potential threat. Early Frankish rulers relied on queens as intermediaries between court and clergy. Many queens were literate at a time when literacy was rare. Several were patrons of monasteries, founders of churches, or correspondents with bishops. They served as advisors to kings, protectors of saints, and, often, the only stabilizing force in courts fractured by infighting. Their influence was spiritual, political, and symbolic, and that made them essential. But as the church grew more organized and began defining orthodoxy with greater rigidity, the ambiguous, hybrid identity of a Merovingian queen, part matriarch, part mystic, part diplomat, did not align neatly with the clerical vision of proper womanhood. Queens who wielded real power disrupted the emerging framework of male-dominated spiritual authority. Women who acted as regents, commanded armies, or negotiated treaties blurred the lines between sacred influence and secular rule. To reinforce its growing authority, the church began reshaping the narrative. Chroniclers, most of whom were monks or clerics, framed powerful queens in moralistic terms. Some, like Brunhild, were recast as corrupt, vengeful, or destabilizing. Others, like Fredegund, were portrayed as embodiments of chaos, dangerous women whose ambitions brought ruin. These portrayals served two purposes. They warned against female political authority and justified the church's increasing moral oversight. Yet the reality was far more complex. Many queens who were vilified had been effective administrators, guardians of royal continuity, or architects of long-term reforms. Brunhild, for instance, established roads, strengthened laws, and built alliances that benefited the kingdom. But because she challenged the power of certain bishops, she became a villain in ecclesiastical writings. Her story, preserved primarily in monastic texts, was distorted until she appeared not as a reformer, but as a schemer deserving brutal execution. When the Carolingians rose to power, this pattern intensified. The new dynasty needed legitimacy, and legitimacy often requires a villain, or at least a weak predecessor. The Merovingian kings were rebranded as do-nothing kings, figureheads manipulated by nobles and queens who supposedly held the true power behind the throne. The narrative was simple and politically expedient. The kingdom had decayed under lax Merovingian rule, and the Carolingians had stepped in to restore order. This narrative conveniently ignored the centuries of Merovingian governance and the structure that queens helped maintain. It overlooked their role in diplomacy, lawmaking, and cultural patronage. Instead, the chroniclers focused on scandals, murders, and palace intrigues, elements that made the dynasty appear unstable and morally compromised. By discrediting the memory of Merovingian women, the Carolingians effectively severed the symbolic lineage that once connected kings to sacred authority. The church had additional motives for suppressing the legacy of the queens. Many Merovingian women held influence that the clergy could neither control nor fully co-opt. Queens were known to engage in practices the church considered dangerous: prophetic dreams, ritual blessings, bone reliquaries, healing rites, and other traditions that blended Christian faith with older, pre-Christian customs. Their spiritual roles often came from ancestral Germanic beliefs, where women had acted as seers, advisors, or priestesses. Such hybrid spirituality threatened the emerging purity of Christian doctrine. Queens who embodied these traditions could not be celebrated without acknowledging these older beliefs. And so, instead of integrating their legacy, chroniclers minimized or condemned it. The mystical elements of queenship, visions, divination, sacred symbols, were reframed as manipulation or superstition. Over time, the silence became structural. Documents written by queens disappeared or were preserved only in fragments. Court records were lost, rewritten, or recopied by hands indifferent to female accomplishment. Queens who founded monasteries had their contributions reassigned to male patrons. Even their names slipped into obscurity, replaced by generalized references to royal wives or consorts. Unlike kings, whose deeds filled annals, queens were often given only a sentence or two, no matter how pivotal their actions had been. This systematic erasure was not always intentional. Sometimes it was the consequence of male-dominated literacy or the turbulent violence of the age. But often it served a purpose. For the Carolingians, diminishing the Merovingian past legitimized their own rise. For the church, minimizing the queens reinforced a moral framework where female power was either sanctified in the form of saintly submission or condemned in the form of moral corruption. There was little room for women who ruled, fought, commanded, or prophesied. Even the queens who were canonized underwent a narrative transformation. Their political deeds faded from memory, replaced by stories of humility, charity, and religious devotion. Their strength was softened to fit the idealized image of holy womanhood. Those who did not become saints often vanished entirely from the record. Yet traces of their power persist, hidden among the ruins of monasteries, in the stray lines of chronicles, in the patterns of royal seals, and in the faint echoes of oral tradition. Modern historians, exploring these fragments, have begun to restore the queens to their rightful place, not as footnotes to kings, but as central figures in a kingdom shaped by their vision, resilience, and authority. The church and the Carolingians did not erase the Merovingian queens completely. They only dimmed their light. And now, across the centuries, that light begins to flicker back to life. Throughout the Merovingian era, the boundary between crown and cloister was far more permeable than later centuries would admit. Queens did not simply disappear when their husbands died or when political tides shifted. They transformed. Some withdrew into the quiet shadows of monasteries. Others shaped entire religious communities. A few were eventually remembered as saints. This movement from throne to cloister was not merely a retreat from politics. It was often a strategic evolution of power, a migration from the visible arena of royal courts to the subtler influence of the sacred world. And in many ways, the monastery offered queens something the palace never could, a realm where their authority could endure long after their earthly rule ended. The monasteries of Merovingian Gaul were not yet the rigid, hierarchical institutions of later medieval Europe. They were dynamic places, centers of literacy, diplomacy, and spiritual experimentation. A queen entering such a space did not necessarily abandon her political identity. Instead, she carried her royal status with her, infusing the monastic community with resources, connections, and prestige. In some cases, she built these communities from the ground up, establishing new convents that blended spiritual devotion with the continuation of her family's legacy. One of the most compelling examples is Queen Radegund, the Thuringian princess who married King Clotaire I. Her story illustrates the complex interplay of power, faith, and personal agency during this period. Radegund fled an abusive marriage and sought sanctuary in the church, eventually founding the Abbey of the Holy Cross in Poitiers. Even within the cloister, she acted with the authority of a queen, corresponding with bishops, securing sacred relics, and shaping the spiritual direction of her community. Her monastery became a political hub wrapped in the appearance of religious devotion. When she was later canonized, the church celebrated her humility and piety, but beneath those layers remains the unmistakable figure of a woman who used sanctity as a form of subtle political resistance. Radegund was not alone. Other Merovingian queens understood that sanctity offered a pathway to a different kind of power, a form that could survive dynastic collapse, political exile, or assassination attempts. In an age when royal courts were rife with intrigue and sudden reversals of fortune, the monastery became a refuge that no rival could easily invade. But it was far more than a refuge. It was a place where a queen could reinvent herself, reshape her legacy, and command spiritual authority that even kings hesitated to challenge. Take Queen Badhild, widow of Clovis II. Sold into slavery as a young woman, she rose to become one of the most influential queens of the dynasty. After her husband's death, she served as regent for her sons and implemented far-reaching reforms. She opposed the trafficking of Christian slaves, supported monastic communities, and strengthened the kingdom's administrative structures. When her regency ended, Badhild retired to the Abbey of Chelles. There, she adopted the life of a nun, but not a passive one. She continued shaping religious policy, advising bishops, and sponsoring charitable works. Her sanctity was not a rejection of politics. It was an extension of it through a different medium. When she was canonized, the Church emphasized her humility and service. Yet historical records reveal a woman who wielded power with extraordinary precision and vision. The movement from throne to cloister also allowed queens to escape the dangerous entanglements of court life. Merovingian succession was notoriously chaotic, with sons, nephews, stepbrothers, and cousins competing for territory. A queen who remained in the palace after her husband's death risked becoming a pawn or an obstacle in these power struggles. By entering a monastery, she removed herself from immediate political danger while retaining a level of influence through spiritual authority, land ownership, and personal connections. But not every queen who entered a convent did so willingly. Some were forced into monastic life by rivals who sought to neutralize their political influence. Yet even in cases where queens were exiled into religious communities, their presence often reshaped the institutions around them. Their networks, education, and royal bearing inevitably conferred prestige upon the monasteries they joined. Over time, these communities preserved fragments of their stories, letters, relics, verses, leaving subtle traces of their agency in a world that otherwise sought to silence them. The Church's portrayal of these queens often softened the complexity of their identities. To fit the idealized framework of sanctity, chroniclers emphasized their compassion, humility, and devotion while downplaying their administrative skill, strategic thinking, or political achievements. A queen could be remembered as a saint only if her worldly authority was painted as incidental, not intentional. Yet the historical evidence shows that these women carried their political instincts into the cloister, shaping the religious landscape of Merovingian Gaul in ways that would echo for centuries. Their sanctity also served another purpose. It preserved the memory of the Merovingian dynasty after its fall. The Carolingians, eager to portray themselves as the legitimate heirs of the Frankish kingdom, had little interest in celebrating the political achievements of their predecessors. But the legacy of saints could not be erased. Through the veneration of Radegund, Bathild, and others, fragments of the Merovingian past survived, protected by the spiritual reverence that even new dynasties hesitated to tamper with. This blending of political survival and spiritual legacy created a unique phenomenon. Queens who maintained influence across drastically different spheres of power. Their voices echoed in councils, monasteries, and liturgies long after their crowns were taken from them. Even in death, their reputations shaped the identity of communities that revered them, turning their lives into symbols of resilience, sacrifice, and moral authority. When viewed from this perspective, the queens who entered monasteries were not retreating from history. They were redirecting it. They transformed their authority into a form of sacred memory, one that outlasted kingdoms and reshaped the cultural identity of medieval Europe. Their quiet acts of leadership, founding monasteries, guiding spiritual communities, advising bishops, or simply surviving in a world hostile to powerful women, became part of the hidden architecture that supported Merovingian legacy. In the silence of cloisters and the glow of candlelit chapels, the true power of these queens endured. While kings ruled with swords and decrees, the queens who entered monasteries ruled with memory, faith, and the subtle influence of sanctity. Through their lives, the story of Merovingia did not fade. It evolved into something deeper, more mysterious, and far more enduring. The fall of the Merovingian dynasty is often described as a slow fading, an empire dissolving under the weight of weak kings and internal fractures. Textbooks repeat the same narrative, that by the 8th century, the Merovingian rulers had become powerless figureheads, overshadowed by the mayors of the palace, particularly the powerful Carolingian family. But when the accepted version of history is placed beside the fragments left behind, letters, monastic writings, legal documents, and even hostile chronicles, another possibility emerges. The collapse may not have been a natural decline. It may have been engineered, step by step, by those who feared not the kings themselves, but the queens, the bloodline, and the spiritual authority the dynasty still represented. The key to understanding this lies in recognizing that Merovingian power did not operate like the centralized monarchies of later medieval Europe. Their authority was diffuse, rooted in sacred symbolism as much as political structure. They were the long-haired kings, rulers whose uncut hair symbolized divine election. Their queens held prophetic roles, shaped alliances, and acted as custodians of lineage. The dynasty's legitimacy depended not only on martial strength, but on mystical continuity. To unseat a king, one had to break more than a political system. One had to sever a spiritual thread. By the 7th century, rivals within the kingdom began to realize that the Merovingian mystique was as much a threat as their armies. The queens, in particular, embodied that mystique. Many served as regents for underage sons, or as mediators between powerful nobles. Their presence maintained dynastic stability. Their alliances stitched the kingdom together. Their sanctity, in some cases, protected their families from political assault. To dismantle the Merovingians, these queens had to be weakened, discredited, or removed. The cases of Brunhild and Fredegund illustrate how the elimination of a queen could shift the balance of power. Both wielded immense influence, ruling as regents, commanding troops, and negotiating treaties. Brunhild's reforms and alliances threatened the ambitions of rising factions. Fredegund's tactical brilliance and ruthless strategy destabilized the efforts of rival families. Each woman represented not just royal authority, but dynastic continuity. Their eventual downfall, violent, public, and symbolic, sent a message. Powerful Merovingian women would not be tolerated. Once queens were removed, the kings themselves became more vulnerable. Without these political anchors, the dynasty lost its internal resilience. The mayors of the palace, particularly the Arnulfing-Pippinid lineage that would become the Carolingians, filled the vacuum. They presented themselves as the practical rulers, strong, stable, devout, while portraying the kings as passive figureheads. But the portrayal was not neutral. It was crafted. Chroniclers close to the Carolingians began rewriting the narrative even before the dynasty formally took power. They described Merovingian kings as idle, incompetent, unable to perform the duties of the throne. They were depicted as puppets, riding in carts while the mayors issued decrees. Yet many of these same weak kings signed laws, presided over councils, and maintained diplomatic relationships, activities barely acknowledged in the Carolingian versions of events. This selective narrative served a purpose. It created a moral and political justification for the eventual takeover. If the Merovingians were portrayed as incapable of ruling, then their displacement would appear not as a usurpation, but as a necessary act of restoration. The church played its own role in this transformation. Many Merovingian queens had resisted ecclesiastical centralization. They supported monasteries independent of direct episcopal control, promoted female religious communities, and protected clerics who challenged rising Orthodox authority. Their spirituality was complex, infused with older traditions and prophetic elements. This ambiguous religiosity threatened the emerging clerical hierarchy, which sought uniform doctrine and centralized power. In response, the church's narratives gradually painted Merovingian queens as morally suspect, overly ambitious, or dangerously mystical. By undermining their reputations, the church weakened the sanctity associated with the dynasty. A king whose queen was described as corrupt could be dismissed as spiritually compromised. A royal line repeatedly associated with scandal could be framed as unworthy of divine favor. This tactic aligned neatly with Carolingian ambitions. As the church gained more influence, and as the Carolingians cultivated closer ties with the clergy, the alliance between ecclesiastical and political forces became nearly impossible for the Merovingians to counter. Another notable pattern emerges when examining the legal and administrative changes of the era. Over time, the mayors of the palace accumulated more direct control over military campaigns, taxation, and diplomatic negotiations. These shifts were rarely sudden. They happened gradually, through incremental reallocations of responsibilities. Each adjustment made the kings slightly less central, slightly less necessary. By the time Charles Martel rose to power, the Carolingians effectively governed the kingdom, while the Merovingians served only as symbolic remnants of an earlier age. Yet even as their political power faded, the symbolic power of the Merovingian bloodline remained potent. Their ancestry, their sacred hair, their connection to prophetic queens, all of these elements carried immense cultural weight. This is why, centuries later, their lineage would become the subject of Grail legends, esoteric theories, and hidden bloodline narratives. To rivals, this symbolic power was a threat long before it became part of Romantic myth. Thus, erasing the Merovingians required more than political takeover. It required a transformation of memory. It required the suppression of queens, the distortion of chronicles, and the creation of a narrative in which the dynasty seemed to fall by its own weakness rather than through coordinated effort. When Pepin the Short finally deposed the last Merovingian king, Childeric III, the act was framed as almost administrative, merely a correction of political imbalance. Childeric was tonsured, symbolically stripping him of sacred power, and sent to a monastery. This removal of royal hair was not just punishment. It was the final severing of the spiritual authority that the dynasty had embodied for centuries. With that single gesture, the Carolingians completed what decades of narrative shaping had begun. Even the manner of the dynasty's end suggests careful orchestration. The transition was astonishingly smooth, given the Merovingians' long history. No civil war erupted. No widespread rebellion rose in defense of the sacred line. The people accepted the new rulers with minimal resistance, demonstrating how thoroughly the political and spiritual ground had been prepared for the takeover. Yet beneath the smooth transition lay a quiet mystery. The bloodline did not entirely vanish. Some branches fled into obscurity. Some married into noble houses. Some disappeared into monastic communities where records were sparse and identities easily concealed. The Carolingians erased the dynasty from the official record, but not from the world entirely. Whether the fall of the Merovingians was a natural decline or a calculated dismantling remains debated. But the convergence of political ambition, clerical influence, narrative manipulation, and the systematic silencing of queens suggests that the dynasty did not simply collapse. It was pushed. And in the silence that followed, new myths began to grow, filling the void with whispers of hidden heirs, lost queens, and a lineage that refused to die. For centuries, the official record has insisted that the Merovingian line died quietly with Childeric III, the last long-haired king, shorn of his sacred hair and sent to a monastery where he vanished from history. But while the Carolingians secured political power, they could never fully silence the persistent whisper that the Merovingian lineage did not vanish. It simply went underground. Across medieval manuscripts, monastic chronicles, genealogical fragments, and esoteric writings, there lies a pattern, a soft but unbroken thread suggesting that the queens of the dynasty ensured the survival of their bloodline by means far more subtle, resilient, and invisible than the blunt politics of their age. The possibility of hidden heirs did not survive through kings or military victories. It survived through women, queens, princesses, nuns, and noble women who carried the lineage quietly across centuries. To understand this theory, one must first understand how Merovingian legitimacy worked. Unlike later dynasties, the Merovingians derived authority not solely from conquest or coronation, but from sacred heredity. Their long hair served as a symbol of divine selection. Their queens were seen as vessels of prophetic dreams, intermediaries between the human world and the divine. If the hair was cut, the mystique weakened, but did not eliminate the bloodline itself. The sacred thread of ancestry could continue through daughters as well as sons. And this is where the hidden survival theory begins, with the women whose names disappeared from official annals, yet whose influence quietly persisted in the shadows. During the final century of Merovingian rule, the Carolingians exercised increasing control over the royal household. They assumed authority in the palace, oversaw the upbringing of royal children, and directed marriages for political ends. Yet some daughters and widows of the dynasty seemed to slip from view at precisely the moments when the power struggle intensified. Records that mention them stop abruptly. Marriages expected of noble women vanish without explanation. Their fates are left incomplete, unresolved, suspended in silence. In a period obsessed with lineage, such gaps are suspiciously convenient. Historians have long debated why these omissions occurred. Some suggest that scribes simply overlooked them, distracted by more pressing political events. But others believe that the queens and princesses were intentionally obscured, hidden in monasteries, protected by loyal families, or quietly moved across borders to secure marriages that would preserve the bloodline without drawing attention. One compelling pattern emerges in a network of monasteries founded or supported by Merovingian queens. Many of these communities were female-led, insulated from outside interference, and connected to noble families sympathetic to the dynasty. A monastery could easily function as a sanctuary for a displaced princess, providing anonymity while also preserving her lineage through strategic marriage once the political climate cooled. Monastic communities kept few detailed records of their noble guests, relying on oral memory that later chroniclers ignored or edited. If a royal daughter lived within such a community, her presence could disappear from the written record almost completely. Another possibility lies within the marriages that did occur but were never fully documented. In the 8th century, during the handover of power from Merovingians to Carolingians, several noble families suddenly rise to prominence. Families with no clear ancestry before this period. Their influence grows rapidly, their wealth expands, and their proximity to the throne becomes unusually close. This phenomenon has led some researchers to propose that these families secretly intermarried with surviving Merovingian women, thus absorbing the sacred bloodline into lineages that could not easily be traced by hostile chroniclers. These theories gained traction in the 19th and 20th centuries when genealogists uncovered suggestive, though not definitive, connections between certain noble houses and the final Merovingian branches. The families of Guilhelmides, the Counts of Razes in southern France, and several obscure Visigoth-descended lineages appear to have intermarried with women who lacked documented origins, but who bore names consistent with Merovingian tradition. The silence surrounding these women may indicate deliberate concealment rather than historical oversight. Then there is the curious case of the region of Septimania, the southern territory bordering the Pyrenees, known for its relative independence, cultural diversity, and political autonomy. During the period of Carolingian consolidation, Septimania became a refuge for displaced nobles, dissident bishops, and families with uncertain loyalties. Reports from later centuries refer to noble houses in this region maintaining ancient blood, sacred lineage, or royal descent older than Charlemagne himself. These cryptic references have fueled speculation that at least one branch of the Merovingian line continued in this secluded territory, protected by allies who resisted Carolingian dominance. The idea of a hidden lineage entering southern France eventually intersected with medieval Grail literature. While the Grail legends are not historical documents, they preserve symbolic memory, echoes of older traditions. In some versions of the story, a secret bloodline plays a central role, guarded by initiates and intertwined with the fate of France. This motif, though romanticized, mirrors the theory that a displaced royal line found refuge in the remote south, sustained by families who kept the memory alive in metaphor, if not in direct record. Later esoteric writers, especially in the modern period, took these hints further, suggesting that certain monastic orders or secret societies may have been formed to protect the descendants of Merovingian queens. While such propositions stretch beyond the boundaries of verifiable history, they reflect a persistent idea that the queens, aware of the threats against their dynasty, took steps to ensure its spiritual and genetic survival outside the reach of political enemies. Whether these theories contain literal truth or symbolic resonance, they highlight one undeniable fact. The women of the Merovingian dynasty were fully capable of sustaining a lineage even in the face of political erasure. Their influence extended beyond courtly life into monasteries, noble households, and alliances that the Carolingians could not fully control. Their descendants, if indeed they survived, would have lived ordinary noble lives, slowly blending into the aristocratic fabric of Europe while carrying the forgotten legacy of a sacred dynasty. But perhaps the most compelling element of this theory is how it refuses to vanish. Century after century, new interpretations emerge. Archaeological clues, rediscovered documents, genealogical anomalies, and literary symbolism that all point towards something unresolved. The Merovingian story ends too abruptly in official history, with too many questions unanswered, too many figures disappearing into silence. The Carolingian narrative of a peaceful transfer of power and the extinction of the Merovingian line seems tidy. Too tidy for a dynasty that once spanned vast territories and shaped the identity of early medieval Europe. If the bloodline did continue, it would not have been through kings or famous warriors. It would have survived through queens and their daughters, through marriages unseen, through communities protected from scrutiny, and through families who preserved ancient heritage quietly, without drawing attention to themselves. These women would have carried within them not just royal ancestry, but the symbolic weight of a dynasty that claimed divine connection, a lineage rooted in myth, prophecy, and sacred authority. The hidden survival theory does not demand that one believe in conspiracies, secret societies, or coded manuscripts. It requires only the recognition that history is often shaped by those who write it, and the Carolingians wrote a version of events that serve their own purposes. What survived outside the official record may be less clear, but not necessarily less true. Somewhere in the tapestry of European ancestry, woven through noble families, monastic lineages, and forgotten branches, there may still flow the faint echo of Merovingian blood, not in crowns or thrones, but in memory, legend, and the quiet persistence of a lineage that refused to die. As modern researchers, geneticists, and esoteric historians sift through the remnants of Europe's early medieval landscape, one question continues to rise like a persistent echo. Does the Merovingian bloodline still exist today? And if it does, what would that even mean for our world, politically, symbolically, spiritually? This is where the conversation shifts from the dusty manuscripts of the past to the pulse of the present, from fading royal tombs to quiet genealogical records that stretch into living memory. Today's historians tend to approach such claims with rigorous skepticism, arguing that the chaotic centuries that followed the fall of the Merovingian dynasty would have fractured any clear lineage. Yet as one traces the surviving noble families of France, Germany, and the Low Countries, compelling hints begin to appear. Names, marriages preserve heraldic symbols and inherited land rights that whisper of deeper roots. Even conservative genealogical studies acknowledge that it is statistically probable for descendants of early medieval dynasties to have survived in the general population. But for the Merovingians, the claim is different. It is not simply survival. It is the continuity of a sacred bloodline, one that in certain esoteric traditions carries profound metaphysical significance. This concept flourished in the 20th century when fringe researchers began to suggest that Merovingian lineage had passed quietly from one noble house to another, shielded from political disruption and church intervention. Families like the House of Lorraine, the House of Habsburg, and even branches of modern-day European aristocracy have been brought into speculative diagrams that attempt to map the hidden vine of Merovingian descent. Some of these theories are elaborate, connecting dots across centuries, weaving a tapestry that is admittedly more poetic than provable. Yet the persistence of the idea reveals how deeply the Merovingians have etched themselves into the collective imagination. But behind the exaggerated claims and imaginative books sits a much quieter, more intriguing truth. Genetic studies conducted over the past 2 decades have revealed that several noble families share rare haplogroups, often associated with early Frankish populations. While this does not conclusively prove a Merovingian link, it does hint at a biological continuity that stretches from antiquity to the present day. Furthermore, private family archives in regions like Alsace, Burgundy, and the Rhineland contain centuries-old genealogies that trace their origin stories back to a royal Frankish ancestor. Whether this ancestor is a symbolic placeholder or a literal descendant remains a matter of interpretation. Meanwhile, esoteric societies have kept the Merovingian flame alive in their own way. Certain Rosicrucian, Templar revivalist, and neo-Gnostic groups hold rituals and teachings that emphasize a royal blood of wisdom, often identifying it with the lineage of the early Frankish kings. These groups do not claim political authority. Rather, they believe the bloodline carries an archetypal significance, representing a spiritual principle that has reincarnated across ages. To them, the Merovingians symbolize the union of earthly sovereignty and mystic insight, a union that modern society has long forgotten. There is also a psychological dimension at play. In a world increasingly dominated by technological systems, global institutions, and abstract power structures, the idea of a bloodline that carries ancient meaning feels both grounding and enchanting. It suggests that beneath the complexity of modern life runs a thread of continuity, a reminder that humanity has roots in mythic soil. Whether symbolic or literal, the notion of a living Merovingian lineage speaks to a hunger for identity, heritage, and story. Yet not all interpretations are benign. Some conspiracy circles have taken the concept of the Merovingian bloodline into darker, more fantastical territories, linking it to shadow governments, secret cabals, and occult puppet masters. These narratives, while gripping, often reflect modern anxieties more than historical reality. The truth, if it exists, is likely far simpler, far quieter, and far more human. If Merovingian descendants walk among us today, they're not hidden rulers or mystical royalty. They are ordinary individuals carrying extraordinary history in their veins, mostly unaware of the ancient whispers encoded into their family trees. Still, even this understated possibility fuels imagination. What would it mean if someone today could prove descent from the dynasty of Clovis or Dagobert? Would it be a symbolic curiosity, a genealogical trophy? Or would it challenge modern assumptions about heritage, identity, and continuity? For some, the bloodline significance lies not in kingship, but in what the Merovingians represented. Early European rulers who straddled the line between myth and statecraft, between pagan mysticism and Christian transformation. To claim Merovingian ancestry is to step into a lineage where history and myth walk side by side. There have been a few modern individuals, from scholars to aristocrats, who subtly hint at connections to this ancient line. They rarely speak publicly about it. The claims, if true, are guarded. Some appear in genealogical forums, carefully tracing links through Carolingian and Burgundy houses. Others reveal fragments of family lore, stories passed down quietly through generations, describing royal origins long forgotten by the broader world. These individuals often approach the legacy with humility rather than grandeur, acknowledging the impossibility of absolute certainty while honoring the symbolic weight their families carry. But perhaps the most captivating aspect of the modern Merovingian question lies in the deeper esoteric idea that a lineage is not defined solely by blood, but by spirit. Some traditions believe that the Merovingian royal essence is less about genetics and more about a particular consciousness, intuitive, mystical, attuned to nature, and capable of bridging worlds. In this interpretation, the descendants are not merely biological carriers. They are bearers of an ancient archetype, one that periodically reawakens in certain individuals, regardless of their name or heritage. And so the Merovingians live on, not just in DNA or obscure family trees, but in stories, ideas, and symbols. Their legacy continues to shape cultural imagination, emerging in novels, films, conspiracy theories, and academic debates. They remain, paradoxically, both historically grounded and mythically unbound. This is why their story endures. It is not limited to the centuries in which they reigned. It stretches across time, adapting to each new era. Today, when someone asks whether the Merovingian bloodline still exists, the answer depends on what one is truly looking for. If the question concerns genetic survival, the likelihood is high. If it seeks a historically unbroken royal lineage, the evidence is thin. But if the question is symbolic, asking whether the Merovingian spirit persists in collective memory, in hidden archives, in whispered legends, then the answer is undeniable. The Merovingians survived not just through descendants, but through the unending human desire to find meaning in ancestry, mystery in history, and continuity in chaos. Their bloodline, whether literal or metaphorical, continues to flow through the world, not as a river of power, but as a quiet stream of myth, heritage, and fascination. It is this stream that draws researchers, dreamers, and storytellers alike, inviting each generation to rediscover the forgotten kings and queens who once shaped the dawn of Europe and who, perhaps, shape us still in ways we have yet to recognize. As the final threads of this long and winding tapestry come into view, the story of the Merovingian queens and their mysterious bloodline begins to transcend the boundaries of recorded history. What started as an inquiry into forgotten royal women, obscured by clerical chroniclers, overshadowed by martial kings, and compressed beneath centuries of political rewriting, slowly reveals itself to be something much larger, something that stretches past the dusty margins of medieval manuscripts and into the modern mind. The Merovingians do not simply belong to the past. They have become part of a living mythos, one that continues to evolve, breathe, and shape the imagination. In the soft silence of historical reflection, one begins to appreciate the peculiar allure that these ancient queens exert across time. They were not the submissive, background figures that later historians attempted to portray. They were strategists, mystics, healers, and political anchors in a world fraught with tribal loyalties and shifting power. Their influence was rarely overt, but often decisive, shaping kings, guiding alliances, ensuring succession, and preserving sacred traditions whose meanings are now mostly lost. Behind every Merovingian king stood a woman whose role was indispensable, even if her name survives only in whispers. And perhaps it is precisely this obscurity that fuels the fascination. The Merovingian queens existed in a space between power and secrecy, between visibility and erasure. Their lives were not fully recorded, leaving behind gaps that modern storytellers, researchers, and dreamers attempt to fill. These gaps become gateways, entry points into speculation, imagination, and symbolic reconstruction. In this sense, the queens represent all the forgotten women of early history, influential, present, and essential, yet hidden behind the veil of incomplete chronicles. Their mysterious aura is further amplified by the legends surrounding the Merovingian bloodline itself. For centuries, writers have speculated that the dynasty carried a kind of spiritual or metaphysical significance, a blend of pagan ancestry, sacred symbolism, and semi-mythic origins. These legends ensure that, even in the 21st century, the Merovingian legacy is not merely a historical curiosity, but a living mystery. Whether one interprets these ideas metaphorically, spiritually, or with literal belief, they give the dynasty a kind of immortality. In the modern world, as we step back from the narrative and allow the dust to settle, a striking realization emerges. The story of the Merovingians is less about answers and more about enduring questions. What does it mean for a dynasty to carry sacred symbolism? Why do certain lineages become shrouded in myth, while others fade quietly into documented obscurity? And why do we, as humans, feel drawn to the idea of secret heirs, hidden queens, forgotten histories, and ancient bloodlines that might still flow through the world today. Perhaps the answer lies in the way history functions as both a record and a mirror. On one level, the Merovingians are a chapter in the early medieval formation of Europe, real rulers who forged alliances, passed laws, built kingdoms, and laid the foundations for later dynasties. But on another level, they're a story we tell ourselves about origins, identity, and the eternal search for belonging. The mystical elements surrounding their lineage offer an escape from the purely rational, inviting us into a realm where symbolism matters as much as fact. This duality, history and myth, fact and possibility, is what makes their narrative so compelling. When we speak of Merovingian queens today, we are not only recounting their historical deeds. We are engaging with the echoes they left behind, echoes that resonate through folklore, esoteric literature, Gnostic interpretations, and alternative histories that seek meaning beneath the surface of recorded events. It is also striking how their story feels oddly relevant today, even in a world dominated by technology and evidence-based systems. The Merovingians remind us that our distant ancestors lived in a world suffused with symbolism, intuition, and sacred ritual. Modern society, for all its advancements, often feels spiritually fragmented, disconnected from holistic traditions. The fascination with ancient bloodlines may reflect a longing for coherence, a desire to reconnect with something older, something rooted in mythic understanding of human experience. In this sense, the Merovingian queens symbolize more than royal figures. They represent the lost feminine archetype of wisdom, diplomacy, and spiritual insight that early writers often ignored. Their hiddenness becomes a metaphor for the suppressed voices of countless women throughout history, whose contributions remain underestimated or unrecorded. To explore their legacy is to honor those forgotten presences, to give space to the shadows that shaped the past as meaningfully as the figures who dominate the written record. The story also invites reflection on how history is constructed. What we know is shaped by those who wrote the chronicles, monks, bishops, and political operatives with agendas of their own. Their selective narratives determine which figures appear noble, which appear dangerous, which are emphasized, and which are erased. The Merovingian queens fell victim to this editorial process, recorded only when convenient, forgotten when inconvenient. Recognizing this invites us to question other accepted narratives, to read between the lines, and to reconsider what may lie hidden in the margins of history. And if we accept that the Merovingians have one foot in fact and another in myth, then it becomes clear why they have captured the imagination of esoteric societies, conspiracy theorists, cinematic storytellers, and alternative historians alike. They exist at the crossroads of the known and the unknowable. Their story is flexible, capable of being grounded in archaeology or lifted into allegory. This fluidity allows each generation to reinterpret the dynasty through its own lens. For some, the Merovingian queens are political figures. For others, they are priestesses of a lost European spirituality. For still others, they are symbols of a hidden lineage that continues through modern times. And this multiplicity is precisely what gives the narrative its longevity. The dynasty ended more than 13 centuries ago, yet the fascination persists because their legacy refuses to be confined. Their history is a puzzle that cannot be fully solved, a tapestry with missing threads that compel the viewer to imagine what once filled the space. As the documentary's journey draws to a close, the deeper message becomes clear. The Merovingians endure because they embody the human craving for continuity, mystery, and the unseen forces that shape our world. Their queens endure because they represent strength hidden behind silence, influence woven through subtlety, and wisdom overshadowed by the louder voices of medieval chroniclers. Together, they form a story that refuses to fade, one that continues to ignite curiosity in historians, inspire novels and films, and haunt the dreams of esoteric researchers searching for traces of lost knowledge. And so the final reflection lingers like candlelight on ancient stone. Somewhere, perhaps buried beneath layers of genealogy, symbolism, and forgotten lore, the spirit of the Merovingian queens moves quietly through time. Their voices, though faint, still echo through the corridors of European history, reminding us that the past is not dead. It is simply waiting to be rediscovered. Their story is a bridge between worlds, between documented history and whispered legend, between earthly rule and spiritual significance, between the visible and the veiled. And as long as humanity continues to seek meaning, to question origins, and to chase the mysteries that lie beneath civilization's surface, the queens of Merovingia will never truly be forgotten. They live on in the stories we tell, the questions we ask, and the silent spaces where history leaves room for wonder.